Over the past year, Jew hatred has become a massive trend, not just among liberals, but also among self-proclaimed conservatives like Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, and Nick Fuentes, to name a few. If you listen to them, you probably think the Jews are secretly running our society and controlling our lives. You may be convinced of the arguments made by those on the far right about isolationism and Christian nationalism, whatever that is, and about how Americans need to stay completely out of the rest of the world. And you may think that these are thoughtful and legitimate arguments, and you may have heard theological and philosophical and even political arguments for all these things. But you would be wrong if you think that they're thoughtful and legitimate arguments. In fact, you would be missing the whole point of what these bad faith actors like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens are actually doing altogether, what their actual goal is. But Rebeccah Heinrich hasn't missed the point. In fact, she wrote a piece for the Free Press last summer called The Right's 1939 Project, in which she dismantled the arguments made by self-proclaimed conservative Christians like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes, and compares their post-World War II revisionist history to the infamous 1619 Project from the New York Times back in 2019. I don't know if you remember that. And so they created a whole revisionist history for the history of America, proceeding from 1619. Rebeccah argues that that's exactly what the right-wingers are doing right now. Rebeccah then later on wrote a piece on the National Review about why Christians should support Israel. And it's my opinion that Rebeccah is one of the only people in conservative circles who is seeing the whole problem facing our culture and calling it out for what it is. And so this is my conversation with Rebeccah Heinrich. I hope you enjoy. I'm here with Rebeccah Heinrichs. We're going to talk about an interesting article that she wrote for Hudson Institute on why Christians should support Israel. Before we do that, Rebeccah, just brief overview. Who are you? What do you do? And why did you write this article?
Sure. So happy to be here with you. So I am a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. I write about America's role in the world, defense and foreign policy. My expertise is specifically in nuclear deterrence and countering the proliferation of nuclear weapons globally. But I'm also a contributing editor at Providence Magazine, which is an online magazine that discusses Christianity and American foreign policy. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So you wrote this article on why Christians should support Israel, which is apparently like a really controversial thing today. Nobody knows how to think on this particular topic. And like, it's actually been surprising to me because I live in the Midwest, and you would think that some of the weird stuff happening on the coasts isn't going to make its way to the Midwest, you know, but like there are people that I know who really like Christians who like really do not like the Jews. Like they're anti-Semitic, they hate the Jews. They're listening to a lot of Tucker, Candace, Nick Fuentes. And it's, in the beginning, it was like, okay, these people are fringe. Now it's like kind of mainstream to blame the Jews for everything. And Christians, I don't feel like have had a good argument. They haven't been able to articulate a good argument for why Christians should be in support of Israel and the Jews. So anyways, can you just give an overview as to your article and what your argument is?
Sure. So if I can first, I'm going to back up just a little bit and zoom out. So in the summer, I wrote an article for the Free Press called The Right's 1939 Project. Yeah. And essentially, so again, I focus my work on American foreign policy. Right up front, just for your listeners' sake, you know, what is the purpose of American foreign policy? And that is, from my perspective, it's to make sure that the American family, the American individual is secure, free, and prosperous. So all of our foreign policy should be in service to that particular end. Mm-hmm. And I was observing that the post-World War II order that has benefited the American people, our security and our prosperity. And what I mean by that, the post-World War II order is the system of alliances that the United States created as a victor in World War II. So it's our system of democratic alliances in Europe. It's also the extended nuclear deterrent that we provide our democratic allies in Asia, Japan, South Korea. And it is the extended deterrent we provide the Europeans. And of course, it's the creation of the nation, the democratic nation of Israel that we know today. Mm-hmm. It's also the notion that it's bad to be anti-Semitic. So that norm was essentially established after the horrors of the Holocaust, mm-hmm. of German Nazism, and the liberation of Europe. That we thought, okay, well, this is bad. We should not ever allow this to normalize again, and that these alliances we've established are going to be used to deter authoritarian imperialism and to do the best we can to defend mm-hmm. the world order in which the United States is the economic military superpower, because that's what protects Americans the best. Right. And, it wasn't delusional. It wasn't sort of like the end of history stuff that, look, and now because we have these alliances, we no longer have to worry about authoritarianism. No, this was an active thing that our politicians needed to continue to work on to preserve the peace that benefits our kids and our kids' kids, Lord mm-hmm. willing. That's sort of the goal here. Right. And I started getting uncomfortable when I started seeing these right-wing podcasters hosting so-called historians, but they were turning the sort of the history on its head. So mm-hmm. this he's not a historian, but this guy, Daryl Cooper, was on Tucker Carlson show, and he's basically put forward the argument that Hitler kind of had a point, and that Churchill was the warmonger. Mm-hmm. And that the U.S. was on the wrong side of World War II. Yeah. And I'm like, well, this is bizarre and interesting. Right. Why is he doing this? And why is Tucker Carlson, a trusted right-wing podcaster who used to be on Fox News, and lots of normal American good-natured families were watching him in the evening on Fox, he leaves Fox and he starts having this guy sort of turn World War II on its head and making the U.S. the bad guy and aligned with the bad guys and saying, you know what, we were all lied to in school, public school. Like, Churchill wasn't the good guy. Hitler was. Hitler just wanted to defend Germany. Right. And so my theory was that there is an analog to the left's 1619 project. Yeah. The 1619 project was to teach Americans that we were not the 1776 people of freedom and of independence and of real anti-racism, which is what the Declaration of Independence represents. It's what Frederick Douglass appealed to when he said, look, slavery, we're not a irredeemably racist nation. Our Declaration of Independence is a freedom document. We just have to align ourselves to this freedom document. Yes, so the left wants to undo that, our understanding of ourselves. The right wants to undo our understanding of ourselves. We're not the 1945 people who liberated Europe. We are the 1939 people who were on the wrong side of World War II. And the result, and I'll end on this point so we can move on to the next question. The result, though, is to make Americans believe that everything we did and created since World War II is wrong, and that we actually shouldn't care about Israel. We shouldn't, and it's actually the Jews, this notion that the Jews they do control us. They are the warmongering people. They have too much outsized control over American foreign policy. And in fact, we should turn inward. Forget NATO, forget the Europeans. I'm not saying there's not some bad things going on here, but it's sort of this, all of this stuff is bad. It's illegitimate. It's the fault of the Jews. And we should turn inward, pull up the drawbridge. And we're back to sort of the first America firsters before World War II that tried to make us isolationists. That's what's going on. Right. So when you cite your friends now who are like, blaming the Jews everywhere, we'll get to this. It's because there is this deliberate push to blame the Jews, to scapegoat the Jews now. And the purpose is to make us turn our back on our allies and the rest of the world. I totally agree. The 1939 article you wrote was so good. I read that and I was like, finally somebody, because the connection to the 1619 project, I was a kid when that came out and all of the liberals went wild, and then they just embedded that into the public school system and told us all growing up that you're inherently racist and that the Pilgrims came over simply because they wanted to murder Native Americans. Like that, there was no other reason. And so they completely upended our history and our genesis as a society. And
And the right has done something similar. So, okay. So there's like theological, political, philosophical aspects to this entire conversation. And it would take hours and hours to get into all of that. But you make a broad, kind of brief argument for why Christians in particular should support Israel. And I want to ask questions about, like, okay, are there distinctions for you between like the state of Israel and then the Jewish people and ethnicity? And because these are all theological questions. I know Paul in Romans makes an appeal to his ethnic Jewishness, but then there's also discussions, and we don't need to get into all of that. But anyways, just break down your argument. I know there's a million things to talk about, but break down your argument as to, so Christians should support Israel, but why?
Sure. So I think both the sort of the medicine for those who have taken in the 1619 Project is the same as the medicine for the 1945 or the 1939 Project. So, first of all, just to get to the end, I believe we are 1776 people and 1945 people, America. Sure. And so I reject this very cynical, nihilistic sort of we're systemically bad and irredeemable. So I want to push back on that.
Yeah.
And they really both come to, here's the medicine. The medicine is properly understanding the philosophical roots of the American founding. Mm-hmm. Who are we as an American people? And then also, of course, it's not just philosophical roots of the American founding. You got to get to the theology that is true. And this is where I think we can go down a bunch of different paths here. But my sort of summary, and I would commend the National Review piece that I wrote explaining why Christians should support the Jewish people. I'm a Christian. I'm a Baptist, and I am doggedly defensive of American Jews, of Jews worldwide. I'm also a big defender of the United States' alliance to Israel. And it comes
you're not receiving checks from Israel.
And I receive no checks from Israel. I will occasionally get these Groyper types who listen to Nick Fuentes and they say, "Oh, you're getting paid from Israel." And I said, "Man, I could really, go on."
Yeah, it would align with your values. You'll take some money for it, but it's not like they're making you do it. Yeah.
No, it comes, my sort of defense comes from my core conviction. It's a conscience matter. Yeah. And that is that Christians in particular, Americans generally, but Christians in particular, should be very defensive of our Jewish friends. First, because we completely reject the notion that there's something in anybody's ethnicity that puts them at odds with the American family, sort of in general. So the idea of human beings being different from animals because we have souls that are imprinted with the image of God. So that is a Christian truism that's right there in the Old Testament in the creation story. Absolutely. But it's also an idea that is shared with Jews. Yeah. And so, and it's actually, this is remarkable. I don't want to gloss over how remarkable it is just for civilizationally, this idea that human beings, I mean, even our enemies have certain rights that we understand because of their imprint of the nature of God in them. Yeah. Now, since the fall, obviously we know that we are, that we all have sin, but still that doesn't take away the dignity that each of us has, not because government gives it to us, but because God, the creator, gives it to us, and he is the one who establishes government, and then government is there to protect those rights. Yeah. So at the time of the American founding, that idea was central to the founders. Now, we had different American founders. Some of them were sort of deists. Some of them had more Calvinistic views. Some of them had, different sort of views about God's relationship with mankind. And yet they all agreed with this idea that that was really it is a Old Testament and New Testament idea shared by Jewish Americans and Christian Americans. And there was an affection there for Jews, even at the time of the American founding, in part because of this shared view. My last point on this, the idea of Christian liberty was really impacted by those first Jewish Americans who were concerned about some Christians at the time wanting a more confessional state. They said, don't forget, Jews do not believe in the same things as Christians, and yet we do have this same view of the worth of the human being and of the importance of the conscience. And so this unique Christian idea of religious liberty and of conscience, and that Christianity is non-coercive. So we want to protect the conscience to believe in God based on your own sort of will. All of these ideas are right there at the American founding. George Washington himself had strong affection for Jewish Americans. And it was Jewish Americans that ensured that our Constitution reflected that right to religious freedom. And so throughout American history, I got this one story I write in the National Review piece where there was a Holocaust survivor.
Yes, that was good. Yeah.
He comes to America after World War II, and he looks around. He said the best place that he could be, that was sort of inoculating against the nihilism that he had known in some of the most educated cities in Europe. The best place were sort of the less formally educated but very vibrant Christian communities in the Bible Belt, because they had such a robust view of religious liberty and of Christian life and community that they were warm and welcoming of Jewish Americans. And that, I think, is what we need to tap into as Christians, to say, look, we are going to speak up. We're not going to let just Jews defend Jews. We as Christians believe that it is our duty to defend Jewish Americans at a time of just rampant and rising anti-Semitism.
Right. And so this is interesting, because there was a book. So to drill to the bottom of this, I'm sure you've read this book by Patrick Deneen, Why Liberalism Failed, which I actually thought was a good book. And I interviewed Patrick, and I think he makes some really good points. I haven't read Regime Change fully, so whatever. I don't know what is in there. But there is a question at the core of sort of the American identity as to what exactly liberty is, or liberalism is, because there's two philosophical outlooks. There's positive liberty and there's negative liberty. And so the left is always going to argue in favor of negative liberty, the freedom from restraints to do whatever somebody wants to do, as long as they don't hurt somebody. And then we just argue over what that means. And then the positive liberty is like the freedom to pursue virtue, essentially. But that's sort of like a secondary philosophy, because you need to know what virtue is. And so this is where you get into conversations of Christian nationalism and like, what is that virtue? What is that moral framework in which liberty is built upon in the United States? And I think that that's an interesting conversation. I think there's a lot of bad ideas surrounding Christian nationalism, but there is some sense to which the founding fathers and those who came over to the United States, the Pilgrims and whatnot, Protestant, Catholic, whatever, they all had that essentially that like mimetic Christian framework of thinking that we don't have today. And I think that's something that people are picking up on. And I'm not like saying Candace or Tucker are right about anything, because I think that they're like paid actors, but people like my age, young people, are picking up on is this like negative liberty thing has not worked for 60 years. Like, we've killed 60 million babies. We've done a bunch of, some of the worst atrocities in world history have been done in the last 60 years by Americans. The main one is murdering a bunch of infants. And some of those people, like myself, like I want to not do that as a country. I want to not do those things. And that seems like you have to impose some sort of moral order. So I don't know, correct how I'm thinking wrong here, or if I am thinking wrong, because like this religious pluralism, I don't think it's going to work when you have like the Muslims and the Christians. But I do think Judeo-Christian does work together. And so does that all make sense? Like,
yes.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I'm not going to, so it's hard. So first of all, this is hard. Yes. It's complex. So we're not going to solve it here on our podcast conversation, but a few thoughts to just put out for food for thought out on the table here. Look, this is, we are far from the vibrant, the Christian mores that were shared at the time of the American founding.
Yeah.
But even at but here was the other problem that the founders were trying to deal with. So they rejected a confessional state. So this is why I think my Christian nationalist friends are wrong on the solution to what we need. That would be anathema to the DNA of what it means to be an American. I also just do not think it would work. Like, I'm a Baptist in the John Calvin tradition. And so I have a lot of similarities with my Presbyterian, PCA Presbyterian, even some Anglican friends, et cetera, and some of my more conservative Catholic friends. But if you start to press all of us I mean, we raise our kids similarly. We sort of have the same kind of, but if you start to press all of us on doctrine and what we would want sort of, you see it's going to fall apart.
It falls apart in 5 seconds. Yeah. I'm a Calvinist and I'm sure you and I don't agree on some really important things. Yeah.
Really important. We might on salvific issues, cooking with gas, on how we should live and sort of raise our kids, probably pretty similar. Yeah. And then we're going to start to fall apart on sort of other issues pretty quick.
Right.
And church unity is even hard just in the same congregation. Yeah. So it just gets really hard when you get sort of cross denomination. Mm-hmm. The founders were concerned about that, but on steroids, because they just left brutal, bloody wars over this stuff.
Right.
And so they were like, listen, we have to consider what Locke said. John Locke was trying to solve these problems. How do we prevent government from turning its guns on Christians over sectarian differences? Mm-hmm. But it couldn't just be Locke. So our post-liberal friends many of them believe that the founding was systemically flawed because of the influence of John Locke, that the focus on Christian liberty and of religious tolerance went too far, because you have to have some grounding term in terms of what is it that we all believe in. Then we get it. You can't have a government that forces these things, but you have to have a society then that understands that we have duties. You have duties. You don't just have liberty. You have duty to one another, and we have to agree on these things. So, so the founders tried to strike this balance to say, look, we need the population to be virtuous and self-governing. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, this thing is not going to work.
Right.
And I do think that you saw, in the 60s and the 70s, the sexual revolution. We went way too far as a country. Mm-hmm. on this idea that that individual, autonomy is the highest goal or the highest thing to protect. It's no, we also have a duty to one another and to our citizens. So I think that our answer is still to return to the founding, but the hard slog. And that doesn't mean look, to the extent that we can on the local government, the local level, and on the state level, pass laws that better align with Christian justice through the consent of the government, by all means, let's do it. I'm all about using the tools of government as long as you can get a consensus, democratic consensus, especially on the life issue, heartbeat bills, things like that. I would vote for every single restriction on abortion that anybody could put forward that we could vote on and get through the legislative bodies.
Do you think that should be a consensus thing? I don't personally, and I agree with most of what you're saying. I don't think that should be a consent. I don't care what the consensus is on that. If we're murdering babies, we're murdering babies.
Listen, I basically believe that the abortion issue is like the slavery issue. I see it the same kind of way.
I agree.
This is where you have the tension between the abolitionists at the time, and then you had the sort of the Lincolnian prudence, which is we want to abolish slavery to the extent we can, or prevent slavery from expanding as a positive good in the Northwest territories. The South wouldn't have it. And so we had a civil war over it. So you try, I would like to avoid imposing through coercive or violent means. And so I would like to persuade my fellow citizens. Now, my concern has been that as we are in sort of the post Roe v. Wade world, you have had states that really want heartbeat bills and things like that, or want to make it more. And you've actually had the federal government, including the Trump administration, that have been against it and have campaigned against those because they want more liberalism in abortion. I think that is a mistake. And so, I'm not going to answer the question now. I think I'm not going to sort of have a sort of an easy, satisfying answer, but I do think that we still need to, the only way out of this is to get to the point where we're making it as illegal as we can, as early as we can, and to create a culture of life affirming, behavior, and also of women and of mom affirming behavior that recognizes the natural complementary differences between men and women. And it's just not going to happen overnight. I mean, the impulse, the human impulse to say, I think I saw somebody the other day on Twitter or on X say, all right, I think it was Laura Loomer was basically like, all right, I want a king. She was like, I'm over it. Like, that's the human fleshly impulse from the time Bible times has been, I'm frustrated with all of this. Give us a king.
Right. And Sorbos or whatever his name is, he said it at the same time, which was weird too. Cause you're like, wait a second, somebody just like sending out a mass text like, hey guys, time to tweet this.
But you can see, believe me, look, I have 5 children. I have 5 children and I want my 5 children to grow up in the next American century that resembles something that I grew up in, that is wholesome and that creates that gives them an environment in which their community spaces are uplifting and that are not just a constant assault on the Christian conscience.
Totally.
And so I want that, and my husband and I and our friends and our church community are seeking to create that. To the extent that we can, and we want that sphere to be as big as possible. Right. I just think that it's going to be much more in the model of Burke, a Burkean model in which we dig in and create these cultures sort of at the local level and move outward. Totally. Rather than at the federal level at pressing down. I just think that there's a lot of risk that can backfire on Christians for a government that's like that.
Sure. And I like principle of subsidiarity. I'm all in on that. I think we got to build local communities and the local churches need to get a lot better in the United States and have a moral backbone. A lot of them don't really, to be completely honest with you, but we should talk again because there's I'm just interested in your understanding of the difference between, so historically my understanding is that after the Civil War, people started saying, these United States of America, not the United States of America. Or sorry, they started saying the United States of America, not these United States of America. So there's a much more of an emphasis prior to the Civil War on the individual nature of each state, whereas afterwards it became we're like one country. And so when we talk about like imposing federal laws on all these states, is your position that each state like should have its own? Like if one state wanted to impose like Christian nationalism, let's say Idaho or something like that, let's say like Doug Wilson got his way and he became the king of Idaho or whatever. Like, would you be okay with that? Or do you think that something fundamentally changed in America's identity after the Civil War to where like things like that, it's so everything's influences each other so much that you couldn't have one state stand alone doing something like that, if that makes any sense?
No, I hear what you're saying. So I still kind of come back to this. I think that just the frame of Christian nationalism is so unhelpful. And again, I keep coming back to sort of the medicine being the way the founders understood a thick theology, that it was still ecumenical enough that it was not a particular sect of Christianity. I think that we still have to go back, understand that, because look, at the time, even with that thick theology, it was not a Christian nationalist state. It was not a confessional state. And yet it still had tons of laws that we would look to now and think, oh my goodness, like, the laws prohibiting and laws, pushing things that we would think are very illiberal in terms of like very non-progressive by today's standards, and yet still lawful and legal under the Constitution at the time. So I think that there's still a lot of runway on what we could do that we would think would be better and more conducive to human flourishing without going the Christian nationalism route. That still understands that, again, as a Christian, we know that you cannot compel or coerce somebody to be a Christian, obviously, that you need to create room for the conscience. And so I think we should still just keep that in mind, that we are still the best stewards of liberty, because we understand that liberty also requires an imposition of duty on the person who has this. And so I really like Dr. Matt Spalding of Hillsdale. He makes, and I don't want to, I name check him and then I don't want to mess up the paraphrasing, but he makes this point that he did a great interview sort of on these lines. And he said, look, he emphasized that the Declaration of Independence is kind of the epitome of what it means, of what we mean. And it's a philosophical, but it's a theological document almost, that we have the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but that we understand that it's the pursuit of happiness properly understood. It does not mean libertinism. It means that what do we understand as Christians? What is happiness? Well, happiness properly understood is the telos of man. What's the telos of man? It's to bring glory to God and enjoy him forever. It's to do good according to God's purposes and be happy in it.
Right.
We know that. Now, but not everybody else agrees with us on what that means. And so you have to create space for people to pursue that, but within guardrails, because some people's idea of what brings them, short-term joy is actually just poison and wrong. And it's not, it's libertinism. But so none of these are in, but this has always been the experiment in self-government. It's always been hard. We just really, I think culturally, really fell off the wagon. You can kind of pick your era of when that really went bad. I think it was the 60s in particular, and the third wave feminism, et cetera. But again, I think a lot of my Christian nationalist friends err by blaming just women in the country for sort of feminized institutions. It's like, listen, we've had men and we've had women, both very involved in the creation of culture. And so it's been both that have created a space that we're in now. So anyway, I think that it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of muscular engagement on the part of Christians that have maybe typically thought, I want to sit this out and I don't want to engage. And I want to have sort of almost like an overemphasis of the two kingdoms of like, I don't, I'm just focused on heavenly minded stuff. And I sort of expect life here on earth to be so, bad anyway, that I'm not going to put some sweat equity into making it better. I think that that's an abandonment of what we need to do as Christian Americans. And we certainly want to be good stewards of our role in a democratic republic. And we want to leave a better place for our kids. Like I said, like I'm constantly thinking about the policies that are going to set my kids up in a better place. And I think that's how we have to think about it. And
I totally agree with you. I mean, like I have 3 kids. I don't want them to grow up in a bad America or in an America that is fundamentally not America, but just has the name. And yet, like a lot of young people aren't having kids anymore. So there's that too. So they don't have that future, the vision towards the future. They're not thinking of anybody except for themselves. And I agree, like the Christian nationalist proclivity towards I saw that they're coming out with a documentary and they kept using the term will to power, I think, in that documentary. And that's Nietzsche. That's not even that's like the opposite of Christianity. Full stop. I don't even think these guys know where that comes from. But the whole purpose of Christian nationalism for people, I think, like Doug Wilson, is basically to get themselves into position of power. That's what I think it is. It feels like a coercive lie.
So I will say sort of, I have nothing to say about Doug Wilson because I do not read him enough to be able to sort of argue with his ideas without him being here himself. And I did see a clip where I thought he did a very nice job of pushing back on anti-Semitism in the
he does. Yeah. He's one of the better ones. Yeah.
He really pushed back on that. And I want to kind of come back to that because I think this is so important. Some of these people, the loudest sort of defenders of so-called Christian nationalism, are the ones who are also very anti-Semitic. Very anti-Semitic. And I think this is very interesting. I even heard an individual who's very involved in movement conservatism and on college campuses tell me that a lot of these young men in particular who listen to Nick Fuentes, the neo-Nazi, that they want Christians who are conservatives, Christian nationalists, to take out the Old Testament. I know. Because they believe that the Old Testament is too, quote, Jewish, and that Christianity needs to really just be the New Testament. What's interesting about this is that was exactly what the Nazis did in Nazi Germany. They called this positive Christianity, which was a removal of the Old Testament. Of course, we know
it's the Marcion heresy.
You need the Old Testament to have the New Testament. You need the law in order to have the law fulfilled. Yeah. You need to understand something about the character of God by the whole Bible, including the Old Testament. And so it is a very heretical, deeply heretical understanding of Christianity.
Right.
And so you can see it's a false Christianity. Anything, if you have somebody claiming Christ and who is also anti-Semitic, you do not have to be a sort of dispensationalist Christian in order to understand that that's wrong. You can just see that, no, we need to understand Judaism and the Old Testament as essential to understanding the New Testament and sort of the redemptive arc that we understand prophesied in the Old Testament fulfilled in the New Testament. So you can already sniff that out and understand that this is wrong thinking. You should not be listening to people who claim to be Christians and who are blaming the Jews in some conspiratorial sense for all of the problems of this country.
I totally agree. It's the Marcion heresy. It's very, very, very old. We've known it's been wrong for quite a while. And like the next step is, okay, take away the Old Testament because it's too Jewish. Then you have to take away Jesus's actual ethnicity because he's too Jewish.
Right.
And then you have to make him into a white Aryan. And then where are you? Then you're back where
it's just a made up religion. It's just a totally made up religion.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's horrifying because so many people are very much convinced of it. I think Francis Schaeffer in his book, How Should We Then Live, describes how our culture has devolved into having two values, personal peace and affluence, which is hyper-individualism and just people just being obsessed with money. And I think that a lot of this stems from that. Rather than taking personal responsibility for anything, the only way to maintain their stuff and their individualism is by blaming some sort of like abstracted enemy thousands of miles away who are like pulling the strings from behind the scenes and in this conspiratorial way, like you're saying. And but it's fascinating because I just didn't expect this to happen because I grew up, everybody agreed that the Nazis were bad and that Hitler was a bad guy and Churchill was a good guy. And it happened in like 2 years. I feel like in 2019, it was like people were normal. And then in 2023, everybody got really weird. Maybe it was after that, but it's just strange.
Yeah, well, here, I mean, look, there is a human kind of, there's this human sinful impulse to blame somebody else for problems that you have participated in, or for those or for those, or for some, it's just this like always looking for a scapegoat.
Yeah. Right.
And one of the oldest bigotries for doing this is to blame the Jews. Right. But if you think about it, it really is a kind of identity politics that's a reaction to left-wing identity politics.
Oh,
and so for the same reasons that Christians should say, no, individuals are, you are still responsible for your own behavior. These other people are not the ones who caused you to behave this way. During COVID, we saw this during the BLM riots, et cetera, this really big sort of from mainstream media kind of blaming the country and our history for the terrible behavior of some angry Black Americans. Yeah. And it's like, no, we're going to reject that. We're not going to blame all these people for this kind of bad behavior. It's the same. So now there's this reaction that you want to blame this other class of people for everything bad that's happened to whatever, young white men or whatever it is. And it's both of them are wrong. We reject an identity politics that pits ethnicities, especially in the United States. Goodness, like a country as diverse as ours, ethnically, it's obviously so foolish, but it's wrong, and it will lead to worse problems. It's not going to fix our problems. But it really was, to your point of where it came from. I really think it was I think it's been years coming. It's sort of my generation, sort of older millennials lived through the sort of left-wing identity politics, and really white men, sort of were penalized in the workplace, in the corporate world, because they were at the bottom of the totem pole of which identities were going to be favored. Yep. They were the most, quote, privileged. And so they were at the bottom of the totem pole. But it was my generations who sort of kind of lived through that. And then our kids have been hearing about it from those who keep griping about it. So now you have this next generation of angry, young white teenagers who they didn't live through it themselves, but they've been hearing about it. This is why it's also important for the older millennials or for Gen X to make sure that we have a healthy way of talking to our kids, our young people, so that they are not growing up embittered and blaming everybody else for their own problems.
Yep. No, I mean, I totally agree. I know you got to go. I'm a 26-year-old white guy from Madison, Wisconsin. So it's like every problem, it was because of me and like a little white guy. I'm a white guy. But the thing that like made me angry is that my parents didn't have degrees. My dad worked like he's a maintenance man. And I just looked around and I was like, we weren't rich. We had whatever. Right. It was like, I don't think that I'm not as privileged as some of the black people that I know. So like, what are you going to do about that? And then it is difficult as you grow older. You have to fight against the impulse, because I have it too, where you want to just be pissed off and be like, you guys blame me for everything. So F you, I'm going to blame you for everything. And that's just not Christianity. In Christianity, it's like, you have to forgive your enemies, love your enemies. And that's annoying sometimes.
Well, I think the other thing too, so I grew up in rural Ohio too, with very, wonderful parents, but very modest in, socioeconomically. And I kind of the same thing. It's like, look, I'm just all around a bunch of poor white people. That was my whole, growing up. Now, who lived wonderful, sort of, took care of themselves and took care of each other. But it's like, oh, come on, this is sort of the Rust Belt.
Yeah,
where a lot of businesses had left, and so it's hard. You can feel this embitterment because people keep saying that you are privileged because necessarily the color of your skin. Yeah. But I do think sort of the Christian answer to that, though, is to remind us that our biggest problems are not sort of outside of us. It's inside of us. It's our own, own sort of like the biggest problem we have is our own sin. Right. And so, yes, this other stuff out here is bad and these people are wrong. It's still in the ranking of what's our biggest problem. It's our biggest problem.
It's like yourself. Yeah.
It's yourself. Yeah. And I think, but reminding yourself of that is very helpful to guarding against bitterness. And it's a very Christian response to say, look, like, but there's still a lot of good and my biggest problems have been solved, sort of eternally and to remind yourself of that. But again, it always comes back to, do we have healthy churches who are teaching the right things and are not shying away from the hard right things that are right there in Scripture? And so it's important to kind of keep going and be reminded of that, because it puts everything else in a better perspective. Yeah,
I mean, John Owen said, "Be killing sin, or sin will be killing you." He didn't say, "Be killing everybody else's sin."
That's right.
Anyways, okay, that was helpful. Yeah, that was great. Rebeccah, thanks for doing this. And I'll put links to your articles. They're very helpful. People should read them. The 1939 Project one I thought was like the best article of the year that I read. Not that means anything, but it was great. So thank you so much for doing this.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.